When considering decision making under uncertainty in the supply chain, then the European Distribution Center quiz that I put on Canvas is a good example of how you have to think about the design of a supply chain and control of a supply chain when you have to cope with uncertainty. Now let's look at the situation again and then see what the results are when you compare alternative strategies, in particular in this case, how to allocate inventory capital in the supply chain in this European distribution center situation. So here we have this, what we call two-echelon supply chain. We see the triangles, which are stock points where you can keep inventory. And you keep inventory to protect against uncertainty in demand. We have Far East production, usually not that flexible. And of course, if you talk about rather high volume goods, typically you would ship them by boat. And then we assume that you still need about 4 weeks for that, and you need about 4 weeks to allow Far East production to be efficient, so that prices are low and people can basically produce high quality goods in high quantities. So we have 8 weeks lead times from the European Distribution Center to get their orders in. And if you order in a local point, say Nordic, Sweden, to a European Distribution Center in Acht, Eindhoven, which was the case at the time, talking early 90s, it was about 3 days to get the product received after having it ordered at the European Distribution Center. And the question we have to ask ourselves then is, how are we going to allocate the inventory capital between the European Distribution Center and regional warehouses? And this was at the time a completely new question. It was clear that in order to meet, say, 95% service level, whatever you define it, you could do it by having inventory over here and inventory over there in some combination. And if you have a lot of inventory over here, you could do less here. And if you have a lot of inventory over here, you could do less over there. And it was really a question, and I was involved in the project setting up the European Distribution Center at the time. And I happened to have worked on this kind of problems already. So I thought, well, I can help them to take the right decision. And in order to make that happen, eventually, because there was some debate on what was right or wrong, I developed this quiz. And let's see, you have seen it. We have therefore every 2 weeks you order at the factories in the Far East, the warehouses in the various parts of Europe order at the EDC every week. And we started with 7 weeks of inventory because that was the initial situation. We had on average 7 weeks of stocks for, in this case, high volume audio products in the countries, the 13 countries at the time of the Western European Union. Fill rate, fraction of demand satisfied from the shelf towards the trade. I'm talking here Philips in electronics, consumer electronics. That was 95% as a target. And we had then 2 scenarios that we wanted to explore: 5 weeks in the European Distribution Center and 2 weeks in the regional warehouse, and the converse was scenario 2. And you were asked to choose. Now, in order to convince the logistics managers at the time of this Philips Consumer Electronics, I used discrete event simulation with some tooling that we had available. And that implied that we had possibilities to do the calculation. So we first looked at scenario 1, that means 5 weeks in the European Distribution Center and 2 weeks in the countries, the 6 leftover warehouses. And basically the outcome was as follows. We had indeed about 7.1 weeks in stock. That was a kind of verification because we assumed some control mechanism to make everything happen. We used reorder point strategies in all stock points. And then we found a regional fill rate, and that is the fill rate towards the trade of 94%, which was just 1% short of the 95 we targeted. And the European Distribution Center did a great job. It was able to satisfy all demands. And then we looked at scenario 2. And what we found was that also we had 7 weeks of inventory, but now we had 100% fill rate at this towards the trade and 95% fill rate from the EDC towards the local warehouses. Now, clearly, scenario 2 is by far the best. In fact, we are overshooting the performance we want, and the fill rate at the European Distribution Center is an internal fill rate, and I couldn't care less, you might say. One of the debates when I did this quiz, and I've done this with, well, really thousands of people in the 1990, because this was a kind of popular topic, and I was asked to do this, to do presentations about supply chain management quite regularly to professionals. I realized that, well, I had debates that if I have 95% service level over here, this 100% is impossible. Now, this is clearly not the case. Because if I have 95% service, then my lead time of 3 days could be 4 or 5, say. But there's always a certain amount of inventory possible to protect against the fact that I don't always get what I want. In fact, even if you have an outside supplier that has inventory, but now and then the truck fails to travel, also there you can cope with. So this is a feasible scenario. We tested, of course, simulation carefully, and this is correct. And the good news is we have tested this also in real life situations, and this is indeed the kind of finding. So it's important to realize that a scenario where you keep a lot of inventory in this European distribution center with the idea that it nicely backs up situations where demand in one location, say Italy, is for a short while bigger than in Sweden, and therefore you would like to have a lot of inventory. Now, that's not the right idea. That's the wrong intuition. In fact, if you think of these 6 warehouses with uncertainties, we basically know already from the so-called portfolio effect that the uncertainty at the European distribution center is relatively smaller. So in that sense, there's not much reason to keep a lot of stock over there, because that's where the cancelling out is. The cancelling out is not at the individual warehouses towards the trade, it's at the European distribution center. But there's another reason, and that's something that I can only say that's apparently the case. It's apparently more valuable to have inventory close to the trade at the end of the supply chain than having inventory upward in the chain. Apparently, because we have the same amount of inventory, and here we get 100% service, and here 6% disservice. Now, finding this kind of makes you wonder, can we do with less inventory, because 100% is far too much? So we looked at another scenario. Scenario 3, we remove 1 week of inventory over here, and we also remove 2 weeks of inventory in the countries. So we have only 4.1 weeks of inventory, so that's quite substantially lower, and we still have 97% service. So we are still above our target. And now we have 80% service only at the European Distribution Center, but again, I say I couldn't care less. So we go one step further. 1 week out in the country, warehouses, the regional warehouses, and we go to 3.1, and then you see we don't meet our performance target of 95% anymore. So that's what we have to then tune a bit further. So we probably can do with less than 4.1, so maybe 3.5 would be fine. Now, I'm not going to explore this further. Important is that we see the idea of keeping inventory upstream, because that allows us to reallocate when needed, is not a good idea. It should be close to the trade where you are supposed to deliver the service. This is a very important thing. This is really what comes with uncertainty. If I would have perfect demand information, well, you don't need any safety stock, so to speak, but then you start thinking, where's the cheapest place to keep the stuff? And then if it's cheaper to keep stuff at the EDC, you would do so. But if it's a little bit cheaper to keep some stuff at the European Distribution Center under uncertainty, you still won't do it. That's also an outcome. We here assumed we only counted the number of audio products of some sort. But even if you have some added value, for example, transportation is added value or added cost. That means that the product in a regional warehouse is slightly higher than in the EDC because of this added cost, and still you would move it primarily downstream.